Welcome to A Faithful Life, where we engage in more depth the questions and issues regarding growing our faith. Welcome to A Faithful Life. In this part of my video series, I want to periodically engage in a longer format for our learning. So this will be more in-depth questions that take a little longer to address, maybe over multiple sessions. And for some of you, this may not be what you're looking for, so I'm separating it out. For others, it may be what you want, so it makes it a little easier. Today, as you see in my title, I want to address the issue of reading scriptures. And as you tell in my title, I say, don't read scriptures. Now, by scriptures, I mean those holy works that we have in various religious traditions, where you and I have things to read and they stimulate us in various ways. And by the scriptures, I mean those writings that are set aside in a special way for our particular faith tradition. For instance, if we talk about the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, then we would talk about the Hebrew Bible, and in particular in the Hebrew Bible for the Jews, the Torah, although the whole scriptures are special. For the Christian church, to some degree, the Hebrew Bible, but that part that the Christians also refer to as the New Testament. And for those in Islam, especially the Qur'an, although for the Muslims as well as the Christians, the Hebrew scriptures have a special place as well. So that's the part that I want to engage with us today. And part of the reason I want to do this is that often I find, at least in my tradition, which is the Christian tradition, we tend to have a particular approach that cuts across the board to reading scriptures. And it takes one of two forms. One is that we say, let's sit down and read the whole scriptures, the whole Bible, in our words. Let's read it from the beginning to the end, and let's understand it in those ways. The other way that I find that we often do it is we either let the Bible fall open to a particular passage or area and begin to read there, and to make it something like an oracle, where something is revealed by chance out of this, or we go and we look at our favorite parts. So when I say don't read scriptures, I'm talking about in particular that we not begin to try to read simply in either of those two ways. Now both of those can be effective, and they can help enhance our faith. But if we do it only in those ways, then it becomes a one-dimensional understanding of the scriptures, be it Jewish scriptures, Christian scriptures, or the scriptures of Islam. So I want to address that in a beginning way today. We'll talk at other times about this as well. But I want to begin to talk about that, and to talk about it especially today around the reading of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Hebrew Scriptures are common to all three parts of the Abrahamic tradition: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And because of that, I think that they have a particular significance for us as we read them. Now, I think that we approach these scriptures with some basic assumptions. And I don't think those assumptions are always correct. So I think we need to name that up front and to name what some of those assumptions are. This is not a global listing, but this is a listing of some of the assumptions that we make regarding the Hebrew Scriptures that I think we need to look at and to address in order to be able to enhance our reading of them, which will then in turn enhance our lives of faith. The first is that when we look at the Hebrew Scriptures, we tend to think that they, along with whatever else our Scriptures are one book. One thing, like going to the local bookstore or going online and getting a book or an e-book, and that is a self-contained entity, that everything within it is written in such a way that it is one book. When in reality it isn't. When you look at the Hebrew Scriptures are a collection of books. They are actually an edited book in itself that contains books within it. And here's the really interesting part about that for me, and it is that there is no common agreement as to what all of those books are. There is some agreement. There's an agreement that the Hebrew Bible contains what Jews call the Torah or the Torah, and what other folks often call the Pentateuch, that those are contained within all of those collections. But there is no common understanding across the board as to what else is in there and in what order they appear. For the Jews, you will see one set of books that are there. For Protestant Christians, you will see another set of books that are there. For Catholic Christians, Western Roman tradition Christians, you will see another set of books that are there. And for Eastern Christian traditions, such as Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox, those traditions have a different set of books there. So you will have a different number in each of those. And also within some of those, the books will not look the same. There will be chapters or parts of the books that will be added in different traditions that are not in others. Growing up as a conservative Protestant Christian, we were often told that the Catholic Bible was not the same as ours, in part because it contains the Apocrypha, which are those scriptures that exist between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. But even within the Hebrew Bible, there is some difference of opinion on what should be contained in there. That collection, when we pull all of those together, is called a canon, C-A-N-O-N. And each of these have different canons. So that assumption says to us that, it's one book. Why don't I just sit down and begin at the beginning and read it all the way through? Well, you can do that. But what you will find is there will not be an understanding that begins in the beginning and runs all the way through to the end, because you're reading different books contained within an edition. The second assumption that we make is they're all written by the same author. At one time in history, to try to kind of pump up the validity of the Pentateuch or the Torah, it was said that Moses wrote those books. There's no evidence that Moses wrote those books. In fact, what the evidence describes is, and as we review them, we believe that those 5 books were written at different times and not as complete books. Not as complete books. Here's a good example of this. If you go to the book of Genesis, the first book of the Torah or the Pentateuch, and you take the first 2 chapters, and I'll try to remember to put these citations on the screen so you can see them. If you go to them, you will see what appears to be 2 different stories of creation. Now, I think many of us are familiar with the one that begins, "In the beginning was God." And that's the first chapter. But about 2 verses or 3 verses into the second chapter, we realize that the whole creation story starts again. In one, humans are created before animals. In others, animals are created first, and humans are created to have dominion over them. Now, because of the language that was used in each of these writings and the ways in which they were written, we believe that those 2 stories evolved in 2 different parts of the Middle East. And that later, someone came forth as an editor or a group of editors and began to put these things together. Beyond that, some of the other stories in Genesis and even into Exodus, in Deuteronomy, we believe are parts of this editorial process. And they emphasize, each editor emphasizes a different thing, much like an editor of a book today would do who's collecting essays. He would choose different essays and would interpret them in different ways. So it's not written in the same way, and it's not written by the same author. Another assumption that we make is because if it's a one thing and it's written by one person, it would all be written at one time. And there's evidence that that's not true either. It seems the collection of the Hebrew Scriptures were written in different times, in different periods of history, often centuries apart. And I think it's important to remember that, because if we don't remember that, then we get caught up in the idea that our way of reading it and seeing it is the only way to do it, when in reality there are others. Now, if we take that frame that it's a single entity in itself, we also fall into the assumption that it's all the same type of literature. And it's not. It's not. I mean, even as you go through and read it, some of the literature is historical. We can validate, for instance, the captivity of Israel by Babylon and Assyria, because we have documents from other cultures at about the same time that say those things happened. So we can see some of these writings as being historical. Some of the writings we have are poetry, absolutely beautiful poetry. Some of it is almost pornographic. When you read it, we try to calm that down a bit by the way we interpret it, but it's not. It's a different type of literature, and some of it is myth. And by myth, I don't mean untrue. I mean that it may have a truth that goes beyond something we can date. When I read the first parts of Genesis, and even when I read the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, in the story of Moses, I read literature that is absolutely beautiful. It engages me and it stirs me, and I know at its core that there is a truth there. I imagine a group of people sitting around a campfire out in the desert in 3,000 years ago, or 4,000 years ago, and a child going, "Grandfather, why are we chosen people?" And then the men or the women or whoever was there began to tell these stories, because there is a huge truth there. But the reality is, we cannot validate historically Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Moses, any of those folks. But we somehow know there is a truth embedded in that goes beyond our ability to validate. So it's not the same kind of literature all the way through. Even with the book of Psalms, where many years ago we decided we were going to say these were all written by David. The reality is that the Psalms are liturgical elements. They were part of worship that were written at different times by different people, and there are different types of psalms. If we can understand these things, that there are these differences in there, then I believe it will enhance our reading of the Scriptures. I think that this is important. You see, I think we have to move beyond a one-dimensional reading of Scriptures, where we read them simply as verses or read them as a whole book. Because if we do that, it will invite us to see them in different ways, and to see God in different ways, and to see God's work in us in different ways. For me, the whole gamut of the canon of all of our Scriptures, I see those as being the stories of our faith, of how we as faithful people have been engaged and pursued by God for centuries. Be that in the Hebrew Scriptures, the New Testament, or in the Qur'an. That in all of these holy writings, God has reached out to us to remind us that we are God's, and that by being God's creatures, we are special in God's eyes, but most importantly, we are loved. So I want to invite us in this time to begin to learn more about our Holy Scriptures. Don't read the Scriptures the way we've always read them. Let's find new ways to understand and to inwardly digest them in ways that will help us grow in our faith and grow in our love of God and hopefully of each other. Don't read the Scriptures in the same way. I'm going to list in the comments below a link for a book entitled Introduction to Hebrew Bible by a man named John Collins. I invite you to take a look at it. It will not be everyone's cup of tea, but I will list it there, and over time we will list others that may fit better for you. Thank you for joining me in trying to live a faithful life and grow in our love and service of the holy. Thank you.